Good evening. You remember that show, Fantasy Island? I always want to say, I'm your host, Mr. Rourke. Welcome to Fantasy Island. But my name is Peter Meehan, and I'm the President and Vice Chancellor of St. Jerome's University, and it's my great pleasure once again to welcome you to the Lectures in Catholic Experience. We acknowledge with respect that St. Jerome's University and the University of Waterloo operate and reside on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our university is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land Frederick Haldeman granted to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River in 1784, and that includes 10 kilometers on both sides of the Grand River and extends from its source to Lake Erie. We give thanks for the privilege to work and live on this land, and we are committed to building respectful relationships with Indigenous people and communities to enhance our knowledge and to learn how we can have an active role in reconciliation. A little bit about the Lectures in Catholic Experience. Since 1982, St. Jerome's University has offered Lectures in Catholic Experience to our local community, providing opportunities for us to engage with the critical issues of our time. We've invited scholars, activists, experts, and religious leaders to address subjects including religion and politics, spirituality, ecological responsibility, religious pluralism, ecumenism, interfaith dialogue, religion, and the media, among others. This year's theme for the lectures, Solidarity in a Time of Solitudes, brings together a series of talks by academics and practitioners who help us to understand the potential for solidarity in a time of solitudes. Our speakers this year will challenge us to think about a, quote, religion of the heart that may not appear in a church pew, remind us of the potential for sport to bridge difference, surprise us with the potential of interfaith dialogue on university campuses, inform our understanding of religion and political polarization, speak to the past, present, and future of a synodal church, and emphasize our collective obligation to people on the margins. Tonight's talk by Professor Matt Hoven will focus on the life, ministry, and career of Father David Bauer, an important figure in two areas of interest for me, the Basilian Fathers and the world of hockey. As we learned tonight, David Bauer was born in 1924 to a prominent Waterloo family that had strong connections to local, international, and professional sport. Despite dreams of playing in the NHL, after meeting the Basilian Fathers at St. Michael's College School in Toronto, he felt a calling to religious life. As a teacher at St. Mike's, he dedicated himself to improving hockey for the nation's youth and coached the St. Michael's Majors to the Memorial Cup in 1961, an achievement that was still being celebrated at the school when I entered grade 9 almost 20 years later. In 1962, he left for St. Mark's College at the University of British Columbia, where I was privileged to serve as president for 6 years. I have fond memories of welcoming many of Father Bauer's former students and players back to St. Mark's for the fundraising golf tournament we named in his honor, all of whom exuded the powerful influence he had played on them, both as a coach and a mentor. In a sense, the denouement of my relationship with Father Bauer took place with my arrival here at St. Jerome's in the summer of 2020. Following my GPS directions to the university, I turned right off of Herb Street onto Father David Bauer Drive. Waterloo is where it all began for him, and in another reality, he might have attended St. Jerome's University and maybe even become a resurrectionist. What do you think about that, Father Tim? Dr. Matt Hoven is Associate Professor and Peter and Doris Kuhl Chair of Catholic Religious Education at St. Joseph's College in the University of Alberta. His books include tonight's talk, Hockey Priest, Father David Bauer and the Spirit of the Canadian Game, and On the Eighth Day, A Catholic Theology of Sport. Drawing from archival and interview research, this evening's talk by Professor Hoven, In a Small Way, Hockey Can Improve the World, Father David Bauer's Vision for Canada's Game, will unpack Father Bauer's person-centered philosophy, which challenged hockey people and all Canadians to see sport as a human activity that can build up communities, support higher ideals, and make for a more peaceful world. I'd like to introduce Dr. Matt Hoven.
Good evening. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here in Waterloo. It was in 2019, January of 2019, I was here. I met with some family, Bauer family, and to learn about Father Bauer, learn about his roots here in Waterloo. And so it was wonderful to come back. The first thing I did when I came to the town, I wanted to check out down on Allen Street, just off of King Street. That's where Father Bauer was raised, and got to see. And the school now is a condo complex. So that's a bit of a change. But it looked good, and it's great to be here. It's a little warmer than it was in January, those few days I was out, but good to see some familiar faces. So for tonight, I'll be having, I'll use a slideshow, but I've made a prepared text. So I'll try to give life to it, but sometimes when I'm working with history, there's so many small details to just talk. You just can't get through the material. So I've got a prepared text, but I'll try to let it come to life. I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A period after that. So I'd love to take any of your questions, and look forward to meeting you afterwards as well. In a small way, hockey can improve the world. Father David Bauer's vision for Canada's game. When Canada hosted its first Winter Olympic Games in Calgary in 1988, Father David Bauer had already been deeply involved in international hockey for nearly 30 years. The men's hockey team he established, Canada's national team, had its workings altered, but it remained the team seeking to win an Olympic gold medal for the country in Calgary. The national team remained modeled upon Bauer's ideals of education, nonviolence, that is, he wanted fast play, an aggressive forecheck without fighting and without goonism, concern for international affairs, and playing for pride in the maple leaf. Bauer spoke prior to the Calgary Games at an event where he promoted Olympic ideals. He told a newspaper reporter that, in a small way, hockey can improve the world. He believed that sport properly directed could assist young people and strengthen communities. He also added a not-so-subtle challenge to the status quo in Canadian hockey. He said, "If we say economics are the only thing that counts, which the NHL keeps saying, we're in serious trouble." This presentation will unpack Bauer's belief that in a small way, hockey can improve the world. It will have two parts. I will start by providing the foundation of his dedication to sport. Here I will briefly outline his upbringing in Waterloo. Raised in the Bauer family, he was placed on fertile ground that enabled him to flourish on the national and international stages. Second, I will explain that the hockey priest was not simply a do-gooder. His dream for hockey extended far beyond commercial purposes within the sport. I will describe three central roles that he takes on. First, he was a hockey coach who worked to improve minor hockey coaching and wanted to create educational pathways in the sport. He also was a hockey diplomat who believed that sport could improve relations between countries. And finally, he was a hockey philosopher, trying to lay out a path forward for Canadian hockey, one that questioned violence in the sport, its anti-educational stance, and its narrow focus on economics. I will begin, just for those who don't know Father Bauer, a very simple timeline about him. There's an image of him that was when he was at St. Michael's College in the late 1950s, 60s, and I have his birth date. Of course, we mark his 100th. He would have been 100 as of this month on November 2nd. He passed away 35 years ago in 1988. So raised in Waterloo, a very sporting family. His brother was in the NHL. And then the second point there is that he ended up at St. Michael's College School in Toronto. At St. Mike's, he's a standout quarterback, hockey player. He wins a Memorial Cup championship as a player. Later on, he becomes a priest in 1953, and he stays at St. Mike's, and he wins another Memorial Cup championship as a coach. And then, as Peter was mentioning, he ends up in Vancouver for quite some time, starting in 61, 62, and then he'll be there until his passing, near his passing in 1988. And so he's in Vancouver. He forges Canada's first ever national team. I like to tell young people that we might watch Olympics, or we might see Canada, players from across the country come together to play, but that hadn't been done before until Father Bauer. So it's really incredible that this man from Waterloo, this priest, was able to get young men who weren't in the NHL to then play for his national team. And they represented the country at several, 3 Olympics and several World Championships. And then he returns to Waterloo at the very end of his life. It's end-of-life care, and he passes away from pancreatic cancer at the end of his life. Just a snapshot of his story, so you kind of get the flow of it and what he's about generally. So part 1, the Bauer family, Waterloo, and David Bauer. In mid-19th century, the Bauer family immigrated from Germany to upstate New York and then settled in Waterloo. In 1888, Alois Bauer married Magdalena Kuntz, and they would become David Bauer's grandparents. The family established a cotton felt and batting manufacturing business in downtown Waterloo. These manufactured products were used for furniture and mattresses and horse and buggy cushions, and later for thermal insulation and soundproofing and automobile manufacturing in the early 20th century. The company prepared supplies for the Ford Motor Company. Even he worked with Henry Ford I. The family was prominent in the area. Waterloo was made up of mostly German speakers at the turn of the 20th century, most of whom belonged to the Lutheran Church. The German Catholic population began growing, and many German Lutherans, wanting to help increase the town's population, supported the building of St. Louis Roman Catholic Church, located near King Street on Allen Street. This conciliatory spirit amongst Catholics and Lutherans in Waterloo also showed itself in wartime soon after. When Canada declared war on Germany in 1914, German immigrants living in the area showed their loyalty to the nation. One report states that the town had the highest per capita contribution to support the war in all of the Dominion, while the neighboring town of Berlin changed its name to Kitchener. David Bauer's parents were married at St. Louis Parish in 1912. Now, this is a picture of a school classroom in 1932, but in the background is the St. Louis Parish that is there still on Allen Street. If you see the pen marks at the very bottom, somebody has written and they've pointed an arrow and said, that's Dave Bauer, front and center. I don't think he liked necessarily being front and center, but somehow he always ended up being front and center. His father, Edgar Bauer, married Alice Bertha Hayes of Irish-Canadian descent. Edgar took over his father's business, becoming the chairman of the then incorporated Bauer's Limited in 1925. The Bauer clan were one of many German industrialist families well connected throughout Kitchener and Waterloo business community. Edgar also became a Waterloo alderman, and served on several local Catholic boards. This civic-mindedness inspired Edgar and Bertha's children. Eldest son Frank served as an alderman and mayor of Waterloo for several terms, while Jerry served on the separate school board in Waterloo. He and his older sister Alice assisted in several organizations helping the mentally disabled. Siblings Margaret and Frank also aided associations related to figure skating, baseball, and hockey. Edgar and Bertha raised 11 children, 6 boys and 5 girls. This is the first house they lived in, but as the number of kids came, they needed a bigger house. So this house is 189 Mary Street. It's still standing. I just took this picture. It was a book actually written about the house. You can go check it out. And behind this house would have been the house that Dave Bauer was raised in. And I'll click here. Here's a portrait of the family taken in the mid-1930s. Again, Dave Bauer's right in the middle. The young kid, he would have been about 11, 12 at that time. And his ears, yes, Paul said about his ears sticking out, but there he is. The Bauer family, so they had sports in their genes, we might say. For years, they flooded their outdoor ice rink at the corner of King and Allen Streets. The Bauer children fussed painstakingly over its condition, so much so that their father, Edgar, installed full-size tennis courts to allow for easier ice making in the winter. Many neighborhood children skated with them. Immediately across King Street sat a modern 2-story brick building that held the offices and factory of the family business. The building is still there today. Somebody told me it's the best waffles and fried chicken in town. The children were excellent athletes. Eldest Frank, along with their future all-star Boston Bruin brother, Bobby, played for the St. Mike's College Junior A Majors and won the 1934 Memorial Cup Championship. Next oldest, Eugene, played Junior A hockey in Kitchener and was recruited by 3 different NHL teams. Brothers Jerry and Ray played a local Junior B championship team in 1940. Some brothers were involved in international hockey, and they were involved in other sports. For instance, 4 boys played together and led a local senior men's team, softball team, to a championship. Their mother, Bertha, was kept busy attending many hockey and ball games each week. The girls were leaders in sport too. Rita, the 3rd eldest daughter, won local figure skating titles. While studying at the University of Toronto, she played many intra-varsity sports, including hockey, at St. Michael's, as did the next youngest, Therese. Alice was an excellent long-distance swimmer and provincial champion. Eldest sister Mary was a champion badminton player, diver, and swimmer. Unwilling to back down, she had a feisty tongue-in-cheek motto, "I like to play, but I play to win." It's into this world that David William Bauer was born in 1924. His family provided him with many opportunities, and it was open to the world around them. The family followed many traditional devotional practices with daily recitation of the rosary during Lent, and the atmosphere between churches was less antagonistic in Waterloo than, say, between Protestant and Catholic churches in Toronto. The family placed civic and nationalistic duties front and center, whether involvement in local politics, military service, or leadership in sporting associations. The Bauers were fully immersed in sport, playing, watching, coaching, and organizing it. This is the spirit, the social and communal life that David Bauer grew up in. From a young age, David felt destined for a life in hockey. He explained to a reporter many years later, "From the time I was 10 years old until the age of 16, I only had one desire, and that was to become a professional hockey player." At 16, as the family legend goes, the young man lowered his hockey bag out of his bedroom window and snuck off to Hershey, Pennsylvania for a Boston Bruins training camp. He made a real impression on the professional hockey men, he recounted. "At that camp, I was invited to play with the Boston Olympics, one of Boston's farm teams. Naturally, my father was concerned. A phone call from him reminded me that he would be on the next train ride to Hershey." His father, Edgar, viewed hockey, in his son's words, as a means for development of my personality, contributing to the growth of physical and emotional side of my life within the framework of a formal education. But for a young David, he instead saw, in his words, hockey as a commercial enterprise, a way of making a good living. The strong pull exerted by the image makers, even then, and that was in 1941, it had so powerful an influence on me that I knowingly and willingly opted out of schoolwork in order to defeat the goals of my father, so that I could be left to pursue my will in peace. David continued, "He told me time and time again, I must try to view the game of hockey within some larger context." Late night discussions with his father had a lasting effect, Instead of being enthralled about the Boston Bruins training camp, the experience left him disillusioned about professional hockey. He explained, "I saw an empty life. It was traumatic indeed, because for years I had been thinking of my own future almost exclusively in terms of playing in the NHL, and now suddenly I had seen that it was insufficient." Thus, he accepted his father's wisdom and agreed to attend St. Michael's College School in Toronto like his brothers Frank and Bobby. The Bauer way, then, was not to see hockey as an end in itself. The sport needed to be kept in perspective, set within a larger framework. This context was one shaped by the family's interest in business, faith, civics, education, and patriotism. What David Bauer received in his upbringing in Waterloo, he would cultivate and grow in a career in hockey in Toronto, Vancouver, Tokyo, and beyond. Part 2, Bauer's alternative vision of Canadian hockey. I was interviewed last month on a local sports talk radio station about the book. The interviewer was a longtime local pundit. His name is Low Tide. I quite like him. And he summed up his impression of Bauer with one word: selfless. The interviewer knew that Dave Bauer had won a national junior championship, both as a player and coach, and had decided to become a priest and then started the national team. Bauer was selfless because instead of taking his gifts to the NHL, he worked with, supported, and mentored young people. In this sense, Bauer was a sacrificial soul, a do-gooder who helped young men in hockey. If we could use the phrase I used at the start of the lecture, in a small way, hockey can improve the world, we might think that this is the small way of Bauer, selflessly giving of oneself to others. Certainly, there is something selfless to the character of David Bauer, but the small way that he suggests was rather a colossal undertaking. When he started the national team in 1963, he called it just crazy. We had no uniforms, no ice, no schedule, no base, no money, nothing. He added, "I'm tempted to say it was a giant act of faith." For comparison, this is not the same as the little way of Saint Therese of Lisieux, the 19th century French Carmelite, who saw the spiritual life as a way of doing ordinary things with extraordinary love. To the contrary, Bauer's small way was to recognize the limitations of the sport and put it in its proper perspective, to specify that hockey is not more important than politics, diplomacy, family, etc., and at the same time, to act with faith that sport could make a real contribution to the lives of Canadians and even to the world. To understand how, in a small way, hockey can improve the world, we must move away from thinking simply of Bauer as a do-gooder, someone accepting less for themselves who sacrifices themselves for others. Instead, we should more accurately be, one more time, he should more accurately be understood as someone who sought to make substantial changes to the sport of hockey so that this sport could become a greater force for good in Canada and the world. To support my viewpoint, it's valuable to recognize how Bauer understood his own personal vocation near the end of his life. This image here, I was able to find it with the Hockey Hall of Fame. I'm putting it somewhere in the early mid-1980s, so this is a few years before he passed by. I like it that he has his hand out and he's got his pen. He's explaining something to someone, and his brow is furrowed. I think he's having a discussion. He's talking with them, trying to talk through. He's probably talking about issues in the sport within Canadian hockey. So in a 1985 speech to Catholic educators in Ontario, he stated outrightly that his own personal desire was to have a Christian family rather than to become a priest or a teacher. Despite this, he stood before a group of educators and declared that, "Probably I'm here today because I've always believed profoundly in Catholic Christian education. That is why I joined the Basilian Fathers like so many others." He explained that he wanted, and I quote, "to play a role in the reconstruction of society, First, by bringing Christian influence into the sporting world. Bauer saw his religious community, the Basilian Fathers, as a way to make sense of the world, a means to influence society through education. This reconstruction was a prominent ultramontane theme taught in church social doctrines beginning with Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum. Bauer, who with many other future Basilians took up this vision with missionary zeal, believed that Christians in English-speaking Canada should take on leading cultural positions in society, including in sport, similar to the rise of Catholic sporting organizations in Europe and in Quebec in the early 1900s. Inspired by his Christian faith, he was willing to dedicate himself to sport, to continue on a faith-based tradition where education was important for hockey players and where economics was not the only voice. I will demonstrate my thesis by describing three of his roles in sport. So hockey coach, hockey diplomat, and hockey philosopher. Together, Bauer's roles and perspectives sought to make hockey a bigger contributor to a nation and the world. Bauer, the hockey coach. I'm just going to grab a drink of water. One of Coach Bauer's favorite phrases was, "If you make a boy a better person, you make him a better hockey player." He believed that coaches should see their players first as people. He promoted a player-centered view of the sport. For this vision, he relied on his university studies, where he was heavily influenced by the French Thomistic philosopher Jacques Maritain. An example of this point of view is taken from a 1967 CBC documentary about violence in sport, where Bauer offers several responses to the interviewer. So this is the documentary, and I just screen captured a couple shots from the interview. Facing questions about human violence in sport, Bauer began with the Western belief that humans require harmony between the life of the body and the life of the mind, because human beings are a unity of the body and soul. The challenge of life, according to Bauer, is to reestablish these harmonies from morning to night. The danger of a sporting life, he argued, is that emotions can overwhelm and block out reason. He argued, and I quote, "Then our lower natures completely dominate, and the desire to love conflicts with the desire to hate." In the case of hockey, money and violence had become central motivators. He saw this exemplified in the Canadian junior hockey system. As one former national team player elsewhere cried, "A boy leaves home at the age of 15 to play hockey in another city, sometimes hundreds of miles away. And at 20, he ends up with a set of false teeth, and if he's lucky, a pro contract." The situation was off balance to Bauer's mind. In the CBC interview, he quipped a line from the 17th century philosopher Blaise Pascal, not to know the relative importance of things is to ever be a child or a slave. In that same documentary, Bauer was unwilling to say that hockey is fundamentally dangerous for youth. Instead, he argued that any contest in any sport that drives participants to seek victory can cause interior, in his words, psychological violence. To combat this mental insecurity, coaches and managers should, Bauer explained, create buffers and create human situations where a player can understand the limits of his potential. Even when a player is demoted, Bauer thought teams were obligated to find value in him, trying to harmonize his abilities, the challenges before him, and his mental health. At this point in the interview, Bauer argued that the greatest teams provide the best supports for players' well-being. He remarked, "Because we are primarily human, we must respond, and we respond best to human treatment. And wherever we act and think consistently with what we are, I really believe that you will get the finest. It will flower in the person. whether he is an amateur or a professional. Pointing out toxic patterns within elite sport is a step toward finding a peaceful harmony between the body and soul. Thus, in a healthy environment, players can understand their limits, cultivate their humanity, and develop rationally so as to sidestep destructive emotions and actions. Coach Bauer's human-centered model for well-being in sport is exemplified in the way he handled his own teams. For instance, I interviewed Mickey McDowell in Vancouver in the summer of 2018. The picture in the top right is the image of Mickey when he was playing hockey for the national team in 1964. But in my interview with him, he spoke about hockey coaches in his youth that were societal rejects who found a place in the hockey world. Their inclusion in youth hockey was neither safe nor beneficial to the development of youth. McDowell had essentially given up on hockey and began his university studies at the University of British Columbia. Soon after, McDowell was approached by Bauer, who asked the young man to come out to a university team practice, just once. McDowell did, and eventually he made the UBC team and ended up on the national team. Bauer showed care toward his players, developed friendships with them. Practices were well organized and cultivated players' abilities. The young men were also expected to succeed in their studies and realize that hockey was about more than getting noticed by the scouts. Just prior to McDowell's passing last year, he recalled Bauer to a local reporter. "I had never had a guy like that before. I couldn't believe what a coach he was. He was so terrific, and he knew the game better than anyone." Bauer's influence kept McDowell involved in hockey in one way or another the rest of his life. He worked alongside or in place of Bauer to run coaching clinics or to do speaking engagements about the national team. In fact, the tradition of the national team hosting coaching and or playing clinics across Canada, which Bauer and McDowell started in the early 60s, was maintained even after Bauer's last team in 1980, where coaches like Dave King and Tom Rennie kept up the tradition well into the 1990s. I'm not trying to argue that Bauer was a perfect coach. He was criticized for being too defensively minded, and later in his career was no longer cutting edge in his systems thinking. But as a hockey coach, he sought to make his players better people, and his players usually had a deep respect for him for that reason. As Hockey Canada's Murray Costello summarized, Bauer was trying to have you see the values in developing all sides of who you are, not just this narrow focus on hockey as the NHL would like. So that was him as a hockey coach, how it forges his vision. And now B is the Bauer, the hockey diplomat. If Bauer was to make changes in hockey to broaden its perspective and to help it achieve the goal of developing the whole person, he would need to work with amateur hockey, international hockey, newspaper reporters, coaches, business supporters, and even find support from some in the professional game. To achieve this, he needed to be a hockey diplomat, and here his work as a priest was particularly helpful. Right. The image there I have on the left, it's a fun game of baseball. They had a priestry, it was with the Basilian priest. This is in the 1950s, and he's playing baseball. He's swinging his bat in the first picture. And in the second picture, in the bottom one, he's coming around to home base. And in the background, there's an umpire. And that umpire there is Father Jim Hanrahan. And Father Hanrahan would write Father Bauer's speeches, his reports specifically. When I started working on this project, I thought I wanted to understand his thinking and how he saw sport. And when I went into different archives, I would find these reports he would write. And I'm like, I have never seen any hockey person who would write reports and speeches. And it was really Father Hanrahan who would sit at the typewriter, and he would bang these out when Father Bauer would say what he wanted to say. And Father Hanrahan was a historian, so he could flesh things out nicely and make it sound fabulous. So they were a good team. Father Hanrahan was not an athlete. That's why he's the umpire of the baseball game. Good. So while the large Bauer family discussions were lively, and anyone found it hard to get in a word edgewise, life in a religious community was different. It called for discretion, careful phrasing, and knowing your audience. This translated well for his work at the highest levels in the hockey world. He had to speak plainly about problems in the game, but not in a radical way. His priestly training taught him to focus attention on the issues or events at hand rather than upon himself. He was smart and thoughtful. Reporters often remarked how much they appreciated discussions with him and how he named important concerns within hockey. As one reporter noted, he fascinated me with some of his ideals and philosophies. Most of them offered even the biggest cynic food for thought. It was this thoughtful approach that Bauer considered international hockey and how it could improve peace among nations caught in the Cold War. The other picture on the right, that was part of his team getting ready, and they were flying overseas. And this is during the Cold War, so it was an incredible experience for these young men to go behind the Iron Curtain. Lots of stories come to mind. The one was Marshall Johnston, who became the general manager of the Ottawa Senators for a time. And he talked about, getting off the plane in the Soviet Union, and there would be soldiers with machine guns there. And he's like, we're just a hockey team from Canada. And the windows were boarded up. They weren't allowed to look out. It was just such a different political time. Maybe not so different in some ways, but anyways. So Bauer built relationships with coaches and national representatives from several hockey nations. He gained a friendship with the legendary Soviet coach Anatoly Tarasov and took several teams behind the Iron Curtain. Bauer sought victory in every game, but he considered the context of international hockey. For example, after the national team was blown out in a game in 1965, forward Brian Conacher left the ice as a winning team's national anthem played. Bauer was livid with Conacher and threatened to send him back to Canada. Bauer then painstakingly explained what was at stake when players wear the maple leaf in international competition. Conacher remembered Bauer's main point, and I quote Conacher here. In the world of sport today, and he's relaying Bauer's main point, in the world of sport today, with its ever-growing competitiveness, no one nation is going to be able to win indefinitely. There has to be something good come out of competitive sport, even at a top international level, for the losers as well. Or nations slowly would withdraw themselves from competing. Even the losers have something to gain in good, keenly contested competition. In that moment, Conacher understood that players modeling the character of Canadians and spreading goodwill internationally was also something of consequence. Bauer's vision for international hockey stood in contrast to Alan Eagleson's bombastic efforts in the sport. It was Eagleson who, despite poor behavior in Moscow at the Summit Series in 1972, managed to convince the government to appoint him as the organizer of the first Major League World Cup of Hockey, the 1976 Canada Cup. As the head of the NHL Players Association and its member on the board of Hockey Canada, he sought to monopolize Hockey Canada's policy decisions about international play. Eagleson and Bauer were named co-chairs of its international committee at the end of 1974. So here you had Bauer, who supported amateur play, and then Eagleson with the professional play. Of course, at the time, professionals in the NHL could not play in the World Championships or at the Olympics. That changes in 1986. But this is 1974. The two men could not have been more different in their approach to sport. Whereas Eagleson brought a win-at-all-costs, Trump-like manner to negotiations, Bauer built diplomatic relations and believed hockey to be an important path to positive outcomes in international affairs. He was a patriot who sought the best for his country, but did so thoughtfully. Bauer soothed troubled waters between other nations and Canada. Eagleson agitated others to get what he wanted. The partnership caused a great deal of stress for Bauer. However, because he thought there was little value in international hockey driven by Eagle's interests in profits and notoriety, he believed that his focus on human development would be helpful, and thus he maintained his involvement for several more years in Hockey Canada. The images here, I just always loved this photo of in 1968. It was Father Bauer's pass to the Grenoble Olympics, and it was in the Basilian archives, and it's just a cool picture of him, a great smile in it. And then the picture on the left, that's a 1980 team of the national team that played in Lake Placid for people in my generation, Glenn Anderson and Randy Gregg. They played for the Oilers with Gretzky, and they were on that team. Folks of a younger generation than me, maybe if you know the Dallas Stars, their general manager, Jim Neal, he played on that team. In 1980, Eagleson led the charge to shelve the national team after the Lake Placid Olympics. While Bauer was betrayed by Hockey Canada's board chair and was effectively removed from his active role in the national team, it was Eagleson who ensured Bauer's larger vision of the sport was buried. At the end of the century, though, Eagleson pleaded guilty to criminal charges of fraud and embezzlement, as several former players demanded that he be removed from the Hockey Hall of Fame. Despite how Eagleson led Canada's role in international hockey, Bauer refused to give up and stood his ground in support of his higher ideals. In the end, Bauer was the longest-serving original board member of Hockey Canada. He maintained his diplomatic means to the very end. Bauer, the hockey philosopher. My third point. Father Bauer liked discussions. In one letter, he wrote to his religious superior about speaking with Japanese youth about their beliefs and values. In the letter, it just sounds like he just starts talking with people at random. He just was that kind of character. It was joked that he liked to hang out at bus stops in Tokyo to talk with people. His nephew Bob teased that when anyone drove his uncle to the airport, they had to be ready for a real conversation about a young person's life direction or the meaning of life itself. Hockey players were not out of bounds for his challenging topics. He talked with them about current events and world affairs. He asked national team members to read Russian dissident and author Alexander Solzhenitsyn to properly frame their hockey playing against the Soviet Union. It was clear that Bauer disagreed with the status quo in Canadian hockey. He believed that its heavy reliance on violence, its lack of engagement in education, its narrow commercial vision, and later its highly scientific approach to the sport were deeply problematic. So first with the violence. Bauer, the hockey philosopher, he had a disdain for fighting in hockey. His brother Bobby had won the Lady Byng Trophy for gentlemanly play in the NHL. Other Basilian priest coaches believed hockey could instill discipline in young boys instead of stoking the fires of rage. National team player Barry McKenzie recounted a story from his playing days with Bauer. We were playing an exhibition game against Czechoslovakia in Sudbury, and they were spitting and kicking at us. We were quite enraged. Then one of their players did something nasty, and Father Bauer leaned over to me on the bench and asked, "Are you going to go get that guy?" I stood up and said, "Yeah, I'll go get him." So he said, "Sit down then, you're not going anywhere." Bauer struck up a friendship with Marshall McLuhan, a professor of media studies at the U of T, who is credited with creating the phrase, "the medium is the message." Channeling insights from McLuhan, Bauer claimed that players came to accept automatically that violence, not human freedom and moral goodness, undergirded the sport and human communities. Bauer believed that this to be the case in major junior hockey, where at least at the time, intimidation mixed with high-drafted natural goal scorers outweighed the value of young people's enthusiasm for team play. The professional game had a restricted philosophical view of hockey that blocked many young players from understanding the game at a higher level and stunted proper human development. These are just a few pictures of the team. On the left are three players on the team. I see from here O'Malley and Conacher. That's in the Father David Bauer Arena that was built. Father Bauer basically talked people into building an arena in a short order of time because his team needed an arena in Vancouver to prepare for the games. There was no arena on the UBC campus, so that arena is still there at UBC. And then the picture on the left is just the team. It's just a great action shot of the players. Bauer, the hockey philosopher, along with many others, was frustrated by the sport's aversion to education. As the Cold War put pressure on Western educational institutions, students and parents felt increased demands of a higher standard of education. For instance, Conn Smythe's son, Stafford Smythe, the family who owned the Toronto Maple Leafs at the time, had comically blamed the Ontario Board of Education in 1960 for putting so much stress on education that the very existence of junior hockey was threatened. This sounds terribly out of step with a child's right to a sound education and underlines a split between hockey and academics. The national team and its ability to enable players to play a high level of hockey and earn an education was a rarity in Canadian hockey at the time. Bauer later philosophically explained the importance of the human individual and for young players to think for themselves. He said, "We're trying to broaden the experience of a boy to be in the position so he is more able to make a personal judgment about his future rather than allow a hockey system to make it for him." This was the alternative he was trying to argue for. It wasn't simply the opportunity for players to go to school, but to enable young people to develop themselves as moral, free human beings for their own benefit and the common good of Canadian society. Bauer, the hockey philosopher, was frustrated by those in hockey who were basically concerned about the economics of the sport alone. He seems to have often repeated the words of former NHL President Clarence Campbell. "We're in it for the money, and it's not my function to take care of 500,000 Canadian boys who play the game." This was a sentiment that drove the truck into the ditch from Bauer's perspective. National team player Glenn Anderson mirrored Bauer's assessment. Father Bauer was always saying pro hockey is not what it's cracked up to be. You're going to have a lot of growing up to do. And he was right. He was very right. There's a lot more that goes on behind the scenes than what is put out in front in either the media's eyes or the public's eyes. As time passed, Bauer, the philosopher, became increasingly concerned with a sporting system promoting an overly scientific viewpoint. Later, leading up to the 1988 games, he explains this threat. "The study of human kinetics and the application of technology have made new levels of achievement possible. The danger that I see, however, is that it is fatally easy to confuse this sort of physiological development with the full development of the human person, for which the Olympic Games provide an opportunity." Bauer, the hockey philosopher, tried to counter this emphasis on violence, avoidance of education, and a narrow focus on money and an overly scientific sport. In a speech before the Lake Placid Games in 1980, he laid out the aims of amateur sport. That is, not to be merely playing for the love of the game, but he looked at it and he thought it was more that it was amateur sport was for those in need of human development. He wrote, "Hockey should not only require the acquisition and mastering of physical skills, it should also provide information that nurtures values, that increases a player's power to create for himself a healthy way of life, be it a pro or an amateur." To sum up Bauer's Christian humanistic perspective about the education of the whole person in sport, he delivered a speech in 1998, just prior to the Calgary Games, and he wrote, "We must see that person, each person, as uniquely valuable. We must see him or her also in relation to others in society, in the familiar, the local, the national, and the world community. We must see the role of athletics in relation to all the other aspects of human activity: social, economic, political, intellectual, artistic, and religious. We must let the spirit prevail. And he went on, the ancient Olympic Games were primarily a religious festival. This is not so with the modern Olympics, and I would not want it to be so. What we do need, however, is a recognition that holding these games offers something much more than an opportunity to develop bodies and hone skills. Peace, justice, love, joy, these are universal human longings that are represented in the Olympic Games. Conclusion. This is Bauer, just prior again to the Calgary Olympics. He's with Terry O'Malley, a member of his 64 team and elsewhere, and Trent Yawney, who went on to coach in the NHL. I know he was with the Oilers a few years ago as an assistant coach. Father Bauer's in the middle, of course. Father Bauer carried the Bauer family ideals of civic-mindedness, patriotism, internationalism, faith, sportsmanship, and the power of sport from his childhood in Waterloo to the national and international stages. To recognize that he believed that in a small way, hockey can improve the world, we need to move past the idea that he was simply a do-gooder. When I began this book project, I wanted to see how Bauer understood sport. How did he square his life as a priest with his hockey life? How did he remain involved in sport for several decades, even up until his death? What I found surprised me. Bauer wasn't simply acting selflessly to help young players. He was intensely involved in the sport, a hockey nut, according to one interviewee, and tried to square that with his Christian faith. I thank President Meehan for inviting me to give this lecture in Catholic experience at St. Jerome's University. I believe that Bauer led a remarkable life in Christian experience and sport. As a hockey coach, he mentored youth. As a diplomat, he sought peace and understanding between nations. As a philosopher, he asked others to meditate upon the meaning of human life and how sport ought to promote the development of human persons. I'd like to finish with one last Bauer quote. A couple weeks ago, I spoke with former national team member Terry O'Malley, the one on the left. Terry shared with me a line that didn't make it in the book, and the quote was, "Be a flash of brilliance in a troubled world." This was the line Bauer used to inspire the 1980 Lake Placid team. Surely it captures his own life and his own Christian experience. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. For those of you I don't know, I'm Carol Ann McGregor. I'm the Vice President Academic and Dean here at St. Jerome's. We do have some time for questions, and I would just ask if you're going to ask a question or share a comment or reflection, we have microphones on each side of the room and in the center, and if you use those, the folks who are attending by a live stream can actually hear the questions. So we welcome all questions or reflections or thoughts. And Professor Hoven's going to field his own questions.
Great. Hello.
Hi. So was Father Bauer viewed as a huge thorn in the side by the NHL?
Yeah, absolutely. He was a thorn in the side. So the way it broke down was that when he starts his national team and they go to the Olympics, he was a hockey guy. He had coached at St. Mike's, he had won a junior championship, and he was always looking for new talent. And so he starts petitioning, reaching out to young hockey players. Some of the most notable ones, for instance, reading in one book, you know, he comes down to cottage country on Lake Huron, and he's meeting with Bobby Orr. Right? He's trying to talk Bobby Orr into it. Serge Savard, the story goes, he was a Hall of Fame player for the Montreal Canadiens. Serge Savard had an agreement with Father Bauer. He's on an airplane in Montreal, and this is when they used to wheel the stairs up to the airplane. So Serge Savard is at the top of the stairs. He's ready to get into the plane, And Sam Pollock, the general manager of the Canadiens, is there, and he's got a Montreal Canadiens jersey, and he says, if you get on that plane, you'll never wear this jersey. And of course, Savard is a good Quebecois, French kid, so he gets off the plane, and he does that. So they were a major pain in the side. And so a tension develops that Bauer's trying to get the top talent, and the NHL a lot of people in the NHL then they didn't want to support Father Bauer or cooperate at least, right? There were some teams, like some NHL teams would play the national team, but not all of them. And there's only so much talent, and they didn't like him taking it. The other problem was, this is back in the day when there were 6 teams, and then later the NHL started expanding. But when the national team players, when they finished the national team, and some of them went on to play in the NHL, they had another life. They maybe had a university degree. They could be a lawyer. They could be a teacher. They didn't have to sign a hockey contract, so they would often negotiate a better contract than somebody whose only life was hockey and didn't really have any other opportunity. Yeah. So.
I may be wrong, but I'm assuming Father Bauer he was never a parish priest.
That's right.
So the question would be, how did the Catholic Church think about his ministry in sports, and did they support it? What was their position?
Yeah, right. So Father Bauer is a part of the Basilian Fathers, and it's a religious community. And so they had several schools. So in the book, I tell stories about, how high school hockey was started by a Basilian priest in Houston. They had schools in Rochester, Detroit, later on, Sudbury, Ottawa, and then they expand out west, Calgary and Saskatoon. So they're living in community, so there'd be several priests. When Father Bauer becomes a priest in 1953, those were the peak numbers of Basilian Fathers. Like, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of them, and they would have many entering the community. So they had good-sized numbers, and they had this school, St. Michael's College School, and he could work there and teach and coach this team. But when he leaves St. Mike's, the team is disbanded because the superiors at St. Michael's say, it used to be our player or our majors team, the top level of junior hockey. They'd play 30 or so games a year. When they won the Memorial Cup championship, they'd played upwards of 80. So to play 80 hockey games and practices and go to school was just too much, and that's why, that's why they ended having that top level hockey at St. Mike's. So Bauer, when he's in Vancouver and he starts the national team, I think other Basilian priests kind of scratched their head at him. The ones I talked to, they felt like, they'd quote, like, they kind of felt like, come on, Bauer, you won a Memorial Cup championship, can you just kind of grow up a bit? Like, get on, do whatever. Why are you staying involved in the sport? And then it was interesting reading Catholic newspapers. They really went in depth about, what are you doing in hockey, Father? And they were trying to understand. And the one great article is when Father Bauer goes to Japan. He's there over about a dozen years, and he would go for a few weeks at a time. And he's helping professional game in Japan, and he's also helping with the national team. And he's explaining all the work they're doing in Japan. He's writing letters back to his converts. To him, he had this sense of a missionary, that he was trying to understand a different culture, and how the Japanese culture, even though it wasn't outwardly religious, it had these traditions he'd write about that kind of held the culture together. One famous quote about it is that even though Father Bauer maybe wasn't at the pulpit at church in a regular parish, that he spoke at the largest, most important pulpit in Canada, and that was on the sports pages of Canadian newspapers. So really prominent in that way. But yeah, people were curious about it. Yeah, for sure.
I'm wondering if most of what you've been talking about is his work in the hockey world.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering about, and it's a bit of a follow-up question to the last one, is there material here for a saint?
Well,
No, and
it's
I
funny.
need-
Terry O'Malley. Finish your question.
Well, yeah, because I've had the honor to work with the Father David Bauer Quest program. And most
right.
of those, starting with what his niece Barbara did
Yes.
and then Mark continues working, doing retreat work. And there is something, it's kind of like making space for the Spirit to flourish,
Yes.
which was his motto. And I've often thought, we talk about, especially now, the emphasis on heroic virtue. Well, his life is full of heroic virtue for the context he was in. And so I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, Father Bauer would have been the last person that wanted to be made a saint. Like that's, and Terry O'Malley, hope I can say this, Terry, if you ever watch this, he would, tell Terry, don't ever try to do that to me, kind of thing, right? Like he didn't want to. So he was humble in that way. Terry wrote a reflection about it. He took a definition of what you're saying, that heroic sense of virtue, of living differently in the world, of the quote that I had at the end about being a flash of brilliance in a troubled world, right? These kind of things. I think, I guess I didn't. I'm fumbling over myself because I never wrote a book trying to do that or to write that about him. It was funny. I wanted to understand how this person of faith engaged the sporting world, and you realize he was fully immersed in it, but he was trying to bring space to the spiritual life in it. And I found that really refreshing in what he was trying to do. It was often misunderstood because he really did need to know the hockey situation. But speaking with people, he would, he tried to live a moral life. The one story, he would say mass daily, and he would do priests have to do their morning prayer and the evening prayer. And one time, this is in a tournament in Europe, and he goes into the men's change room and he's doing his prayers. And he's in a cubicle or a stall. Well, all the guys pour into the dressing room and they don't know he's in there. Well, you can imagine what 20-year-old men, 20 of them talk about, right? Girls and drinking and whatever else. And then Father Bauer, partway through, walks out of the cubicle, right? And they just said it went dead silent, and through he went. There were little things he'd say if somebody was, would swear, say the Lord's name in vain. Oh, Jesus Christ. He'd say, hey there. I do the praying. And he had these little ways of trying to make light of it, because for some it was awkward. Marshall Johnson, the one of the players who became the general manager of the Senators, he would say, I was on the power play. I wasn't a Catholic, but as long as you were good enough, you could be on the power play, right? So they had jokes about like that. Yeah. No more questions? I just thanks for coming out. This is a joy for me to come to Waterloo. I know how important the Bauer family is, and I know many of you are Bauers, I'm assuming here. So it's a real treat for me to be here and for all of you to be here and to share this evening with you.
Well, let me just quickly close us off with a few notes of gratitude, starting with thank you, Matt Hoven, for coming with us. My commute tonight involves a drive on Father David Bauer street, and I'll think about it differently. And I think each time I drive that street now, I will be thinking of little gems from this talk. So thank you for being with us. Our friends from Wordsworth Books are here. They have copies of the book. I think Matt would be happy to sign copies and chat with anyone who'd like to chat with him about the book. And I want to offer just a couple of other thank yous. So thank you to Jamie Phillip and Courtney Windhold from the marketing and communications team at St. Jerome's. They help us with all of the registration and setup and communication about the event. Norm Clare at the Unmarketing Group is recording and live streaming this event. So if you had a friend or colleague or family member who couldn't make the talk tonight, they are recorded, so you'll be able to pass the talk along to others. Thanks to our facilities team who set up tonight's space. We have some delicious treats out there if you didn't have some from Pam, our catering coordinator, and we encourage you to continue to enjoy those before you leave. The series is going to take a short break for the holiday season. We hope you enjoy Christmas with your friends and family. We'll be back with a first talk on January 9th. It'll be offered by Dr. Amir Hussein. He's at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. He's going to give a really interesting lecture drawing from his personal experience as a Muslim scholar working in a Catholic university to kind of weave a story of interfaith dialogue. He's got a new book coming out, One God and Two Religions, Christians and Muslims as Neighbors. And we hope you'll come back and join us then. So thank you, everyone.